Shanda Vander Ark and the sin of sloth. This tells you everything you need to know about this case. She vomited in court when she was shown photos of her own son that she starved and tortured. Just weeks later, she got life in prison. Welcome to the deadly sin of sloth, to understand the why behind the unthinkable. And this is a case that shocked the nation. A story of no sudden rage or calculated greed, but really it was a slow, agonizing death of her teenage son. We're talking about, of course, the tragic death of Timothy Vander Ark and the four horrifying actions, or really rather the inactions, of his mother, Shanda Vander Ark. Many of you might remember the headlines. In July of 2022, 15-year-old Timothy Vander Ark was found dead inside his home in Indiana. 16 years old, he weighed only 68 pounds. The images released during the trial were a punch to the gut. He was emaciated, covered in wounds, suffering from severe hypothermia and malnourishment. He had no clothes to wear, and hypothermia was one of the reasons he died. The finger of blame always pointed squarely at his mother, Shanda Vander Ark, and her adult biological son, Paul Brachter. When this first broke as a case, there was an immediate assumption for many, and probably also myself, if I were going to be honest, that the case was driven by gluttony, that Shanda denied Timothy food so that she could indulge herself. Maybe because of money, maybe she didn't have the finances to pay him, but that's not the case. As the trial unfolded, the disturbing details of Timothy's last months emerged, and the sin of sloth and really came to the forefront. This mother worked in the legal field at a law firm. She made good money. So it was not about not being able to feed her son. And I want to be clear, we're not just talking about basic laziness. We're talking about a pathological neglect far beyond not doing chores or shirking responsibilities. And she really failed to care for, protect, or nourish her own child. The sin sloth, it is a failure to care for or make an effort in fulfilling one's duties and responsibilities, particularly towards others. This can manifest as disengagement from relationships and neglecting spiritual growth. This is the clear motive in this case, the why behind the crime. I'm Ashley Willcott, a TV anchor, a former judge, a trial attorney. I can tell you that all of the many, many cases that I've seen, that I've tried, intersect with one of the 7 deadly sins as motive. Pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth, the opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues. Temptations that, when taken too far, turn deadly. This week, we break down the case of a mother, Shanda Vander Ark, and how the deadly sin of sloth tortured her own child to his death while she was watching on video cameras from work. A little later, I'm joined by criminal defense attorney Eric Faddis in our breakdown segment, where we go deep on the how and the why behind the horrific conditions and torturing of her 15-year-old son. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. This was a case that was not built on speculation or circumstantial whispers. The prosecution in this case presented a mountain of disturbing evidence that really painted a very clear picture of systemic abuse and neglect by Timothy's mother. The most immediate and visceral evidence was Timothy himself. His mother called 911. Law enforcement shows up. And on July 6th of 2022, they found the 15-year-old in the basement. He was unresponsive. The pictures shown to the jury are nothing short of horrific. The most immediate and visceral evidence was Timothy himself. When the authorities responded to the 911 call that was placed by the mother, Shanda, on July 6th of 2022, they found her 15-year-old son, Timothy, in the basement, unresponsive. He weighed only 68 pounds as a 15-year-old. Medical examiners later confirmed his cause of death as dehydration and malnutrition, with hypothermia as a contributing factor. Of course, the manner of death, no surprise, was ruled a homicide. The pictures that this jury had to see of this poor little boy as a teenager were devastating. But I want to add to that the scene itself. Police body cam video was played to the jury, and it captured initial discussions between law enforcement, Shanda Vander Ark, the mother, and her adult son, Paul Bratcher. Paul lived in the home with the mother and Timothy. And the conditions in the home, specifically where Timothy was in the basement, were immediately suspicious. The police admitted photos into evidence of locks on the refrigerator and freezer, alarms on the closet door. Paul Bratcher himself testified that his brother Timothy was forced to live in a small padlocked closet in the basement with only a blue tarp and an Amazon box inside. The officers described the smell, an overwhelming odor of urine and feces in that little bitty room where this 16-year-old was locked and made to live. The other part of the crucial evidence in this case came from the adult son of Shanda Vander Ark, the testimony of Paul Bratcher, because he faced child abuse charges, but the prosecution's theory was she was the ringleader. The mother made him do it, so to speak. So he got a plea deal in agreement for testifying against his own mother. And he described so many details that really sealed her fate. Number one, he said that the child Timothy was subjected to ice baths, including the day before Timothy's death, where Timothy was forced into cold water, sometimes for over 9 hours. The mother would speak to Paul. Mother would be at work, Paul would be in the home, and tell him, it's time for an ice bath, put him in the ice water. He further testified that Timothy was denied food and water. He was routinely starved, often for days. Paul said the mother of both of them, Shanda, would tell him that Timothy was faking a hunger strike. He was forced to consume hot sauce. The details of this case, anyone would throw up listening to. Timothy was made to eat bread soaked in extremely hot sauce, made from two of the world's hottest known sauces and hottest peppers available on the market. And the other thing that she would do as punishment was pour those sauces directly into his mouth. Sometimes that would be all the food that he would get. That would be it. Also, Paul testified that the handcuffs and zip ties found in that basement were used to restrict Timothy's movement. There are also leg irons found in the home. Now, mother says, oh, no. Paul, my adult son, ordered those. I didn't order those. I mentioned earlier the cameras. The mother would be at work and watch Timothy on the cameras. She would watch to make sure that her adult son, Paul, did the discipline to Timothy that she told him he had to do, whether it was an ice bath, whether it was the hot sauce in his mouth. And he also would be made to stand facing a wall for hours. The other thing that the mother told Paul you have to do to discipline him, he's such a horrible kid, was forcing Timothy to run up and down the stairs. Remember, he was in the basement, multi-story home, up and down the stairs while Paul chased him. And imagine that's after ice baths, not being fed, not being watered, and eating hot sauce. There were also many text messages between Shanda and her adult son, Paul, and they were chilling and blamed Timothy and said that Timothy was faking symptoms, and that's why he had to be disciplined, that she would throw ice cold water on him. And that was seen in a video. She would throw that water on him to discipline him. Paul even expressed frustration in a text and said to his mother in the text, I'm ready to kill Timothy. So he was not innocent in all of this. These text messages, when taken all together, really provided a clear record of their shared involvement in the systematic abuse of Timothy. During the trial, Shonda herself, a piece of work as the mother of both of these children, she took the stand and said, I never meant to hurt Timothy, that I had memory gaps due to disassociation. But her testimony was contradicted by a lot of the evidence, including when she threw up, when she had to look at pictures of her own son, unresponsive, emaciated in her basement. At the end of the day, the evidence presented was overwhelming, and Shanda Vander Ark was convicted for the murder of her son. It was a case built on undeniable facts, heartbreaking details, and really revealing a horrifying pattern of cruelty and neglect, doing nothing for her son that ultimately cost Timothy his life. Joining us now is Eric Faddis, criminal defense attorney. And Eric, you've been a guest legal analyst on so many different networks. You come on Court TV, and I really appreciate your insight as a criminal defense attorney. We were just talking, and you said, oh, sure, I remember this case. It was one that none of us could turn away from because it was like watching a car wreck, right? It's so horrific. And I think there are a lot of different seven deadly sins that could have been her motive, but I'm really stuck on the sloth because this was not about a physical act of doing something to nurture and protect and care for her teenage son. Instead, it was really it seems to be an utter lack of will, a complete absence of any effort to fulfill her maternal obligations. Let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, just I mean, what really came through in the trial for me is just this sort of complete indifference to, trying to do what a mom should do. And in fact, on top of that, at times during her testimony, Shanda Vander Ark actually blamed her son, blamed her dead son. For his alleged misbehavior. He was a teenager, and it seemed like she just sort of threw up her hands in the worst way possible and decided not to deal with this in a constructive or nurturing fashion, but rather just, kind of let him flounder and waste away. He was 68 pounds when his body was found as a 16-year-old.
And as a criminal defense attorney, how do you handle these cases? What do you do when you see, because this one, the evidence that was the strongest, in my opinion, were the pictures of him and the pictures of the room and everything that she had done to him. And so when you have visual prompts for the jury to see how bad it was, how do you fight that in court?
Ooh, hard to neutralize that, right? I mean, there is an evocative emotional impact that comes from seeing these photos of this poor boy who is emaciated. He's got wounds all over his body. What do you do to mitigate that? A number of things that were looked into, is my understanding, is, Shanda Vander Ark's mental health background, whether she had been the victim of any kind of trauma, and also her older son,
Paul,
Paul
yes,
Bratzer.
Paul, yes.
There were potentially some legally defensive avenues to explore in terms of Paul's role, and was Paul really more involved than the prosecution let on here? Those were things that the defense considered, and I think did their best to present. But at the end of the day, these were just such damning visuals that I think that really swayed the jury.
And of course, Paul did testify, and that was in exchange for a plea deal that he would testify against his mother, and he did. But I also feel like it's interesting because the sloth sin manifesting in a failure to provide the basic necessities for her son Paul, but yet she was willing to get up on the stand and testify and say, "It wasn't me, it was Paul. I never intended to hurt him," which I was astounded because I thought, okay, now you're really sunk. You never should have gotten up there and said all of this. So, talk a little bit about, did she do herself in? Might it have been a more successful argument to point a finger at Paul if she had remained quiet in front of this jury?
It's always a very sensitive and delicate decision whether your client is going to testify at trial, especially when we have these heinous allegations of harming a child. And I think when she got up there, there are ways that her defense team could have pointed the finger that didn't require her to get up in front of this jury and sort of blame her other son personally, coming from her. If it comes from the defense attorney, it softens the blow a little bit. It's easier for the jury to digest and receive, I think. But when the mother gets up there and says, "Oh, yeah, my son died and it's my other son's fault," I think that rubbed folks the wrong way.
Yeah, I think it would as well. What's the worst you've seen? I mean, we're talking today about a crime against a child, and yeah, it's one of the hardest things to stomach and talk about, but I always believe that shining the light is so important because you can't even imagine a mother would do this to her own child. It's really unthinkable. And the fact that she had videos that she could watch live from court, which she would, that's on her phone, that she'd pull it up and look and make sure that Paul was doing her bidding and throwing ice water on him or running up and down the stairs and making him chase him, all these things. And so she's evil. Like, what's the worst that you see? And how do you speak to the evil nature of so many crimes that we do see?
Yeah, in a lot of these child abuse cases, especially involving severe neglect, one thing that appears to be a theme is sort of the self indulgence of the parents, the narcissism. It's their world, and they're in control, and in fact, sometimes the problems in their life are then transmuted and inflicted upon their own children. And so I think it's sort of them indulging in themselves and what they want and what their life is going to be like, and even if that's at the expense of and in this case the death of their own child due to neglect, malnourishment, and everything else you can think of.
Yeah, I think there's a screw loose. I don't think you do these kinds of things unless something has happened to you that's so bad or there's some mental health component because it's just unfathomable this would happen. And her complete and utter lack of care. But here's what's weird. She did care for Paul. She enlisted him to do her bidding to hurt um Timothy, and we know Timothy was adopted. Paul was her biological son. That shouldn't make a difference. They're all your children. Could that have made a difference? And why would she be so focused on she had a good job, she was making good money, by all accounts, she was smart, and yet this is what she did to her son, only one of them. Why could that be?
Judge Ashley, that is a potentially dark distinction, I think. Because, like you said, her child Paul, she seemed to treat reasonably well, and so why in the world would she, contrast that with how she is going to treat this adopted child? Is it a sense of alienation? Is it a sense of a lack of connection with this child? So therefore, we're going to make his life hell. It could be. The inner workings of the psyche of these folks are very complicated. But I think that distinction was pronounced at trial, and the jury had kind of said, "Hey, why in the world are you taking care of one kid and then neglecting the other so badly that they die?"
Yeah, and where was everybody else? We always say that. I know a lot of people don't want to report. They don't want to get involved. They feel like it's not their business. They feel like everything's okay. But the reality is, there were other people from this boy's life. He had been in foster care for a while. Actually, he had been with his father who got ill, and the mother said, "I will take him back since you can't care for him, and I don't want him to go into foster care." And so that statement by the mother and recognizing she thought this was a better fate than foster care. Are you kidding me? Who thinks that?
And there were measures that Shanda Vander Ark took to kind of seclude young Timothy to try and disconnect him from the outside world. But that being said, you've got to imagine there are people who are aware of this. Paul, the other son, he's an adult, and certainly he was in a difficult situation, arguably. But he knew what was going on. I'm sure other folks became aware, or at least got the sense of red flags and possible mistreatment of this child. And it's hard to come forward in those scenarios, but sometimes it can make all the difference. And perhaps we wouldn't be here discussing this.
Make all the difference. We were just prior to discussing a cold case, and 45 years in, it took before they finally were able to solve it. And one of the things I can tell you is that the little girl, 11-year-old, was found in a ditch. And Eric, they found out that at 11:30 p.m. the night before, on the day she disappeared, there was a woman who lived up above, and she heard a female voice say, "Stop it, you're hurting me." She didn't call the police, and it arguably was that little girl. It could have saved her life, and so I think it's always important to remember, hey, if you suspect something, think something, please say something, because this little boy, you don't die from hypothermia, malnutrition, dehydration overnight. It takes time. It's a slow, painful death. The medical examiner confirmed that. And so when it's a slow, painful death, that's the intent piece, that they intended to do it. She said she didn't intend to do it. How do you defend specifically an intent piece of a crime? Talk to us about that part.
Sure. So, the intent piece, the prosecution has to prove what was going on inside the defendant's head. That's hard to do. We don't have like some kind of medical imaging that can show you thoughts. And so, the prosecution is going to present their evidence regarding intent, a pattern of conduct over a period of time that appeared deliberate. On the other hand, on the defense side, there are all different kinds of motivations for human behavior. Some might be unsavory, some might be things we don't want to think about. But those things can also be sort of the causal foundation of why a person acts a certain way they do. And perhaps on the defense side, that they could have argued that, hey, she didn't want to harm this child, and she testified as much. But instead, this was, her own lack. This was her own inadequacy. These were her own failings that unfortunately did have an effect on this child. But that's different than an intent to affirmatively harm somebody else.
And when you're speaking about intent and the prosecution has to present evidence as to that, I think the problem is it's easy to poke holes in it for the reason you just said. If you're a good criminal defense attorney, you can say, hey, you can't read their mind and you can't infer that she necessarily meant to do it. And add to that, in this case, that Shanda did testify and say, I didn't intend to hurt him. Is that all an issue of credibility? Did the jury have to say either they believe her or not to decide that piece?
I mean, credibility is huge and it is paramount if your client is going to testify. And I think in this case, the jury couldn't square the objective physical evidence with Vander Ark's testimony that, hey, I didn't mean to do this. I didn't intend this. But you look at, like you said, this happened over the period of months and months. It wasn't a one-time isolated event where somebody made a mistake. I think the prosecution was able to show that this was deliberate conduct. That she had a conscious objective over a period of time, arguably, to do what she did. And so her getting up there and saying, "Oh no, I didn't intend it." Well, we've got all this evidence contradicting that, and that evidence is stronger than how we perceive your credibility, Miss Vander Ark.
And we were just talking a little bit ago off camera about how now people are really supporting certain defendants. Karen Reed is a great example of people supporting her and her innocence. You've got Luigi and the alleged murder. He hasn't been convicted, alleged murder of the healthcare CEO. You've got Brian Koberger, and there are supporters now coming out for him as well. Those crimes are different, but no less horrific. Are you seeing any kind of trend or movement towards people really supporting, maybe even supporting a mother like this and saying, listen, she was simply trying to discipline him. He had behavioral issues.
Yeah, that does appear to be an emerging trend, and I think there are some positives to that, not necessarily in the cases you mentioned, but I think for the longest time, it was really easy for the public to sort of receive these accusations against folks from the government, say, "Oh, they must have done it, and what a monster, that's horrible." I think we're looking at it with a more broader perspective, which is important. However, can that result in some folks who are factually guilty being able to kind of slither out of it? It can. And so it's really a double-edged sword.
Yeah, it is. And we know there are false convictions. That's a problem within our system. I believe it's the best criminal justice system in the world. But of course, sometimes that can happen. This is not one of those cases. Sloth, the sin of not caring when caring is a life or death imperative. She's been convicted, spending her life in jail as she should be. Eric Faddis, thank you so much for all your expertise today.
Great to be with you.